The sun was setting over the small southern town, casting a warm orange glow that barely softened the sharp divisions running deep through the streets. In the heart of the town stood two churches, one black, one white. Each building, though similar in size, stood as a stark reminder of the separation between the two communities. The black church, where Pastor Elijah Carter had led his congregation for years, was a place of refuge for many. It wasn't just a church, it was a lifeline. Pastor Elijah had built an outreach program that helped struggling families with food, shelter, and even legal aid. To the black community, Elijah was more than a preacher. He was a symbol of strength and hope, a steady voice in a world that often tried to silence their pain. On the other side of town stood the white church, led by Reverend Matthew Collins. Though well respected, his congregation remained largely untouched by the struggles of the black community. The separation was cultural, but it was also unspoken, something that had always been there, lingering in the background. But beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful town, tensions ran high. The silence of segregation wasn't peace. It was an uneasy quiet, waiting for the right spark to ignite it. And in this town, the spark had already been lit. Pastor Elijah Carter wasn't just known for preaching the gospel, he was known for preaching unity, equality, and justice. But to those in power, especially the police, he was trouble. He was a troublemaker who dared to speak out against the system that oppressed the black community. For Sergeant Blake Henderson and his officers, Pastor Elijah's influence was a growing threat that needed to be suppressed. "I don't like the direction this town's heading," Sergeant Henderson muttered to his fellow officers in the dimly lit precinct. "Carter's stirring something up, and it's only a matter of time before it gets out of control." They had watched him closely, monitored his movements, any sign of rebellion, and they would act swiftly. But it wasn't just Pastor Elijah they feared. It was the unity he was fostering among the black community. They were growing stronger, more vocal and more organized, and Henderson had no intention of letting that continue unchecked. Elijah had been fighting for justice for years, but it had always been in the background. Then came the case of a young black teenager, Marcus Johnson, wrongfully convicted of a crime he didn't commit. The trial was a sham. The evidence didn't add up. But it didn't matter. The jury convicted him anyway. The courtroom, filled with prejudice and blind eyes, had sentenced another black child to a future of imprisonment and suffering. It wasn't just Marcus who had been condemned. It was the entire black community who had been sentenced to live in a system that treated them as inferior. Pastor Elijah couldn't stand by, not this time. He stood in front of his congregation, his voice steady and strong as he laid out the plan. "We cannot sit by while another one of our young men is stolen from us. We will not be silent. We will stand together. We will demand justice." The call for a prayer vigil spread quickly through the community. It was a peaceful stand. Candles, songs, prayers for the safety of Marcus and for justice to be done. But even in its quiet dignity, the vigil was a challenge. It was a challenge to the authority that had long ignored their cries. A challenge to the power that upheld the system of injustice. The evening of the vigil, people gathered in small groups. Outside the courthouse, their faces illuminated by candlelight, their eyes determined and full of hope. The air was thick with emotion, a mix of fear, hope, and a quiet sense of resistance. Pastor Elijah walked among them, offering words of comfort, his presence a rock for those who needed it. But not everyone in town was pleased with the scene unfolding in front of them. A group of white residents stood at the edge of the gathering, their faces twisted with disgust. They whispered among themselves, their voices laced with contempt. "It's just a matter of time before trouble comes," one muttered. His eyes narrowed as he watched Pastor Elijah lead the crowd in prayer. The whispers reached the ears of Sergeant Henderson, who stood with his officers nearby, his eyes scanning the crowd. The peaceful gathering was a direct challenge to everything he believed. It didn't matter that it was peaceful. It didn't matter that they were only asking for justice. For him, it was a threat, and he wasn't about to let it go unchallenged. As the last hymn echoed through the street, the heavy boots of police officers broke the silence. Henderson stepped forward, his voice cold, his gaze steely. "Pastor Carter, this needs to end. Now," he said, his hand resting on the baton at his side. "You're disturbing the peace. It's time to go." The air seemed to freeze as Elijah's eyes met Henderson's. He didn't flinch. His voice was calm but firm. "We are here to pray for justice. We are here to be heard. If that disturbs the peace, then maybe it's time the peace was disturbed." The officers moved in, grabbing Elijah by the arms, pushing him roughly to the ground. He resisted, but not with violence, just a steady refusal to bend. His congregation watched in horror, some too afraid to speak out, others too shocked to move. "Let him go," one woman cried, stepping forward, but a sharp look from Henderson stopped her in her tracks. The crowd grew restless, but Elijah's voice cut through the chaos. "Stay calm. We're here for justice. Don't let them take our dignity." But it was too late. The officers dragged him away, his feet scraping against the ground. The once peaceful vigil was now a scene of brutality. The police drove off with Elijah in the back of the squad car. The reality of the moment settled over the town. The black community was devastated, but they knew better than to speak out too loudly. In a place like this, speaking out could cost them more than they were willing to lose. The fear of retaliation from the police had silenced them for far too long, but for one man, the silence was no longer an option. Reverend Matthew Collins watched from his church window as the officers drove Elijah away. His heart pounded in his chest. The image of Elijah being dragged away stayed with him, a weight in his conscience. He had always stood by, remaining neutral, in the fight against injustice. But this was different. This wasn't just a matter of right and wrong, it was a matter of the soul. Matthew sat at his desk, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the edge. The town was divided, the lines drawn so deep that crossing them could destroy everything he had worked for. But Elijah's arrest was a call he couldn't ignore. "I can't stay silent anymore," he whispered to himself. But the question that haunted him was simple. What would it cost him to stand up? Would he lose his congregation, his community, his standing in this town? He had spent years preaching unity, but the world around him was built on division. The question gnawed at him, but the memory of Elijah's calm defiance was too powerful to ignore. The air was thick with tension as the quiet hum of the prayer vigil filled the evening air. Pastor Elijah stood at the front of the crowd, his voice steady and calm, but his eyes were filled with purpose. Candles flickered gently in the hands of those gathered, their light flickering like a small defiance in a world that was too often darkened by injustice. Elijah had asked for nothing more than peace. A simple plea for justice for Marcus Johnson, a young black teenager wrongly convicted, but the heavy presence of law enforcement, the scowls and whispers of white townspeople told a different story. The quiet of the crowd was broken only by the sound of distant sirens, low, ominous, and closing in. Sergeant Blake Henderson, the same officer who had long viewed Pastor Elijah as a troublemaker, was watching from across the street. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the gathering, his hand resting on the baton at his waist. He didn't need to speak to his officers. They knew their orders. A flash of movement broke through the calm. Henderson stepped forward, his boots echoing on the pavement as he crossed to the front of the vigil. "Pastor Carter," he said, his voice grating like gravel. "You're disturbing the peace. This ends now. You're inciting a riot." Elijah didn't flinch. His voice remained steady as he addressed the crowd, keeping his back straight and his chin high. "We are here to pray. We are here to ask for justice, for fairness. Is that a crime?" Henderson didn't respond. His eyes flashed with irritation, and before anyone could react, officers surged forward, hands grabbing at Elijah's arms, pulling him back toward the waiting squad cars. The crowd gasped in horror as the officers twisted his wrists, dragging him away with no explanation, no remorse. The force with which they moved him only amplified the injustice. "No," someone shouted, breaking the silence. "Let him go." But there was no stopping it now. Elijah's body was roughly shoved into the back of the patrol car, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed through the streets. The crowd stood frozen, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had witnessed it before, this kind of brutality, this kind of power being wielded against them. It was the same story, written over and over. Matthew Collins, the white pastor of the church across town, watched from his window. His face was pale, his fists clenched tightly by his sides. He had seen injustice in the town before. He had heard the whispers, felt the tension simmering beneath the surface. But this was different. Elijah wasn't just another black man to be silenced. He was a man fighting for what was right, for the soul of the community. And they were dragging him away, like a criminal. Matthew's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the squad car disappear into the night. He had always tried to keep his distance from the fights of the town. He had always stayed in his lane, preaching unity from the pulpit, but never fully stepping into the fray. He had kept his congregation calm, quiet, safe. But now, as the weight of what had just happened sank in, the silence he had maintained for so long began to feel suffocating. "Should I have done something?" he whispered to himself. "Should I have said something?" His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his own congregation, murmuring in confusion, fear, and anger. Outside his church, the weight of the injustice pressed down on him, and, for the first time, he wondered if his silence had been a form of complicity. Days passed. News spread quickly throughout the town, and with it came the sharp divide. The black community was reeling, but they feared speaking out. The police had a long history of retaliation, of taking swift, violent action against anyone who dared challenge them. Many knew that speaking up would only make things worse, losing their jobs, being harassed, their lives turned upside down. But deep inside, Matthew could feel the pull of his conscience. He had spent so many years building his church on a foundation of love and unity. Yet here was a clear division, a blatant injustice he could no longer ignore. He couldn't stay silent. As he sat in his office, wrestling with the weight of his decision, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. One of his parishioners stood at the threshold, her face tear-streaked. "Reverend Collins," she said, her voice trembling. "Elijah's daughter is here. She's asking when her daddy is coming home. I don't know what to say to her. What do I tell her?" The words hit Matthew like a slap to the face. His heart twisted in his chest. How could he look at this innocent little girl and not do something? Her father, a man of peace and justice, was locked away, framed as a violent agitator. And this sweet child was left without answers. Without thinking, Matthew rose from his desk, his body moving on its own, driven by a force greater than fear. "I'll be right there." When he entered the sanctuary, he saw her, little Mariah, no older than 6, sitting in the front pew. Her small hands were clasped together as she prayed, whispering into the air, her voice so soft that it barely broke the stillness. "When is my daddy coming home?" she asked again, the same question that had echoed in Matthew's mind ever since Elijah's arrest. The question shattered him. He could feel his own heart breaking, knowing that the little girl had more courage than most of the adults in this town combined. What kind of world were they raising her in? A world where a father could be taken from his child for nothing more than asking for justice. I don't know, baby, Matthew whispered, kneeling beside her. His voice was shaky, filled with the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. But we're going to do everything we can to bring him home. I promise you that. And in that moment, everything changed for him. The fear, the doubts, the hesitation, they all melted away. He couldn't be silent anymore. He couldn't stand by while this injustice continued. His church, his community, his conscience, it all demanded action. Matthew rose to his feet, his heart heavy but resolute. He walked back to the pulpit, his mind made up. The decision had been made. No more silence, no more waiting. It was time to take a stand. I will not stand by while another man is torn from his family. I will not stay silent while the cries for justice go unheard. Matthew said, his voice stronger than it had ever been. He looked out at his congregation, his eyes scanning the room. We will fight for what's right, and we will not be afraid. The church was silent, the weight of Matthew's decision pressing down on him like a heavy stone. He stood at the pulpit, staring at the empty chairs. But in his mind, he could feel the eyes of his congregation upon him. Their expectations, their judgments, they all lingered in the air, thick with anticipation. He had known this moment was coming. He had known that he could no longer stay silent, but knowing that didn't make it easier. For years, he had played it safe. He had built his church on the foundations of love, peace, and unity. But what did those words mean if he wasn't willing to stand up for the truth? Pastor Elijah was behind bars, his only crime being a call for justice. And Matthew had watched it happen, had stood by while injustice unfolded. Now he couldn't look at himself in the mirror and call himself a man of God if he didn't act. He inhaled deeply, his chest tight, and stepped forward to the microphone. His voice, when it came, was quiet but clear. Brothers and sisters, he began, the words almost foreign to him. I have struggled with this decision for days, for weeks, but I can no longer pretend that everything is okay, that the world is as it should be. His gaze swept across the congregation, some faces tense, others curious. There is a sickness in this town, a sickness that has been here for far too long. A sickness of racism, of hatred, of fear. A murmur spread through the room, an uncomfortable ripple. Some of the older members shifted in their seats, exchanging glances. You may not want to hear it, Matthew continued, his voice growing stronger, but it's the truth. Pastor Elijah is behind bars because of a lie built on fear and prejudice, and I refuse to stand by while that lie festers and grows. The room was silent now, the air thick with disbelief. Some faces were twisted in shock, others with anger. A woman in the second row, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, stood up and shouted, You're talking about that preacher? He's stirring up trouble. He's the reason for all this chaos. Matthew's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't flinch. He stood his ground, feeling the weight of the congregation's eyes upon him. No, the chaos was there long before Elijah ever came to town. The chaos is in the streets, in the schools, in the hearts of those who turn a blind eye to the pain of their neighbors. His voice broke, just for a moment, but it was enough. I can't be silent anymore. We cannot be silent anymore. He let the words sink in. Some people nodded, others shook their heads in disbelief. He could see the struggle in their eyes, their discomfort with the truth. An older man stood, his voice trembling with anger. Matthew, you're ruining everything. We've built a community here. We've worked hard to keep peace between the races. You can't just tear it all down with your accusations. His voice cracked as he spoke, the fear in his eyes evident. This will destroy the church. It'll destroy everything we've worked for. Matthew took a deep breath, holding the gaze of the man. "You want to know what will destroy us?" he said, his voice low but firm. "It's the silence, the refusal to face the truth. We can't keep pretending that everything is fine when people like Pastor Elijah are treated like criminals just for demanding justice." The man faltered, his face pale as Matthew's words settled into the room. For a moment the congregation was still. Then, from the back of the room, a woman's voice rose, soft but clear. "I'm with you, Pastor Matthew. I don't know how we fix this, but I know we can't just sit by anymore." Slowly others began to stand. Some nodded, some wiped away tears. The room was shifting, the tide turning, but Matthew knew this was just the beginning. Pastor Elijah stepped out of the police van, his face weary but resolute. It had been weeks, long weeks of uncertainty, of feeling the weight of a system designed to break him. But now, the door was open, and freedom beckoned. As he walked into the waiting arms of his community, the relief was palpable. A crowd had gathered, faces filled with emotion, their eyes bright with hope. They cheered, they clapped, some even cried. Elijah's heart swelled, and for a moment the years of struggle seemed worth it. He looked out over the sea of faces, seeing black and white people standing together, united for one cause. It wasn't just about his release, it was about something bigger. The joy in the air wasn't just for him, it was for them all, for everyone who had been a part of the fight. The unity, though hard-won, felt real in that moment. Elijah made his way through the crowd to the church, where a joint service was being held, black and white congregants side by side. As he stepped into the church, the applause was thunderous, a collective breath of relief, of triumph. But there was something else in the air too, a sense of change, of transformation. It wasn't just the return of a leader, it was the return of hope. Elijah knew the road ahead would still be rocky, that the battle for justice wasn't over. But in that moment, as the congregation stood together, he felt the power of unity. It was as if the walls that had divided them for so long were beginning to crumble. "Thank you," Elijah said, his voice shaking slightly with emotion as he stepped to the front. "Thank you for your strength, for your courage. What we've done here today is not just for me. It's for all of us. It's for our children. It's for justice." The service began, but there was an unspoken understanding among everyone present. This was more than just a worship service. It was a celebration of resilience, of fighting back against an unjust system. As the choir sang, their voices rising in harmony, Elijah couldn't help but notice how different the atmosphere felt. There was a shared understanding that they were all part of something bigger than themselves. They had fought for justice, and they had won, at least for now. Later, as the church began to empty, the reality of what had happened began to settle over Matthew like a heavy fog. The first few weeks after Elijah's arrest had been a whirlwind. He had stood firm in his decision, even when the pressure had mounted, even when the calls for him to stay quiet had grown louder. And now, Elijah was free. But at what cost? Matthew looked out over the empty pews, his mind replaying the faces of those who had stood with him and those who had walked away. The white members of his congregation had slowly begun to leave, one by one, unable to accept his stance for justice. Their absence hurt more than he had expected. Some had been long-time friends. They had shared meals, prayers, and moments of joy, and now they were gone. He didn't blame them, not really. He understood their fear, their discomfort with the change that was happening. But still, it didn't make the loss any easier to bear. His wife, Rebecca, had remained steadfast by his side, offering her quiet support in the midst of the storm. She didn't say much, but he could see the weight in her eyes, the understanding that their lives had changed forever. Their children, too, seemed to sense the gravity of the situation. They didn't ask questions. They just held his hand a little tighter, offering their silent encouragement. Matthew walked over to his office, his mind heavy with the reality of his sacrifice. He sat at his desk and buried his face in his hands. He had never imagined that standing up for what was right would come with such a cost. The world around him had shifted. His comfortable life, built on the idea of peace and quiet, had crumbled. But in the midst of the pain, he felt something else, a deep, unshakable conviction. He had chosen the right path. "This is what it means to lead," he whispered to himself, the words echoing in the quiet room. "This is what it means to stand for truth."